Stop everything, because what just happened on the Breakfast Club sent shockwaves through hip-hop, boxing, and social media all at once. What was supposed to be a routine interview suddenly turned into a tension-filled moment nobody saw coming, and now Claressa Shields is reportedly livid. Here's how it went down. Papoose sat in that chair calm, collected, media-trained, until one unexpected question cut straight through the room like a blade. A question about Remy, his ex, his past. A chapter many thought was permanently closed. The room shifted instantly. The hosts paused. Papoose hesitated just long enough for the internet to smell blood. Within minutes, clips started circulating. Slow-motion breakdowns. Zoomed-in facial expressions. People swearing they caught a microreaction that said everything. And then came the fallout. Because according to online chatter and insider whispers, Claressa Shields did not take that moment lightly. Fans say her energy online flipped fast. Posts deleted, stories subtweeted, a tone that went from confident to confrontational in record time. Boxing Twitter collided with hip-hop Twitter, and suddenly everyone was asking the same dangerous question. Why did that question even get asked? And why did it land so hard? Some say it was disrespect, others say it exposed unresolved tension, and a few are convinced it cracked open something that was never fully healed. Add in Breakfast Club history, old Remy Papoose loyalty narratives, and Claressa's no-nonsense reputation, and now you've got a perfect storm. Whatever happened after those mics cut off, that's where the real story might be hiding. And judging by the reaction brewing online, this is far from over. The moment Papoose sat down on the Breakfast Club, nobody expected the interview to turn into a cultural pressure test. It started smooth, laughs, career talk, growth, reflection. The kind of conversation that feels safe, predictable, controlled, until it wasn't. Because buried inside what sounded like a casual question was a name that still carries weight in hip-hop history. Remy Ma. And the second that name entered the room, everything changed. People watching live swear they felt the temperature drop through the screen. The hosts didn't raise their voices. The tone didn't turn hostile, but there was a pause, brief, almost polite, that screamed louder than any argument ever could. Papoose didn't snap. He didn't deflect aggressively. He answered carefully, measured, like someone who knows every word will be dissected frame by frame within minutes. And that's exactly what happened. Clips hit social media before the segment even finished airing. Twitter Spaces popped up instantly. TikTok creators slowed the footage down, analyzing facial expressions like forensic evidence. Reddit threads started connecting dots that may or may not exist, but once the internet smells tension, it doesn't wait for confirmation. What really sent the situation into overdrive wasn't what Papoose said, it was what he didn't say. He didn't shut the question down. He didn't redirect completely. He didn't pretend the past never happened. Instead, he acknowledged history without reopening it, a balance that sounds easy until you realize how rarely celebrities manage to pull it off. But that balance came with a cost, because for a lot of viewers, neutrality doesn't read as closure, it reads as unfinished business. And that's where Claressa Shields entered the conversation. Within hours, fans began monitoring her social media activity with a microscope. Stories that disappeared, posts that felt subtler than usual, a tone shift that people immediately labeled as anger, frustration, or disappointment, depending on who you asked. No direct statements, no callouts, just enough movement to let people know she was aware. That awareness alone was enough to ignite speculation, because Claressa Shields isn't known for passive reactions. She's outspoken, direct, competitive by nature. When she feels disrespected, real or perceived, she doesn't usually sit quietly. So when she didn't address it head-on, people assumed something serious was happening behind the scenes. Insiders, and that word is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, began floating claims that Claressa felt blindsided by the question being asked at all. Not because of insecurity, but because of respect. In her world, once a chapter is closed, it stays closed. Dragging old narratives into new spaces isn't harmless, it's provocative. And the Breakfast Club has history. They've broken relationships before. They've reignited feuds with a single question. They know exactly which names carry emotional weight. So the debate online quickly shifted from Papoose's answer to why the question was asked in the first place. Was it journalistic curiosity? Was it bait? Or was it a calculated move designed to generate viral tension? Fans took sides immediately. Some argued that Remy Ma is part of hip-hop history and therefore fair game, that you can't erase a marriage that defined an era just because people move on. Others fired back hard, saying growth should mean something, and that constantly forcing people to relive old relationships is lazy, invasive, and disrespectful. But the loudest voices weren't debating ethics. They were watching Claressa, because shortly after the clip went viral, she reportedly liked and unliked posts that hinted at frustration. Boxing fans noticed her energy change during interactions. Hip-hop fans claimed she was subtweeting without subtweeting. Every emoji, every caption, every absence became evidence in the court of public opinion. And still no statement. That silence only amplified the narrative that something had struck a nerve. Meanwhile, Papoose remained publicly composed. No follow-up posts, no clarifications, no defensive reactions, which to some fans looked like maturity. To others, it looked like avoidance. The same action interpreted in two completely different ways. What complicated things further was how Remy Ma's name alone still divides opinion. To some, she's a legend. To others, a source of unresolved drama. And to many, a reminder that public relationships never really end. They just go quiet until someone presses replay. People began revisiting old interviews, old loyalty speeches, old clips of Papoose standing 10 toes down, then comparing them to his current relationship, his current demeanor, his current silence. The internet doesn't just watch the present, it rewrites the past in real time. By the end of the day, the narrative had ballooned far beyond one interview question. Now it was about boundaries, about respect between current and former partners, about whether growth means closure or coexistence. And hovering over all of it was Claressa Shields, a champion who built her career on strength, self-definition, and refusing to be minimized. Suddenly positioned by the internet as someone reacting emotionally to a moment she didn't create. That framing alone made the situation volatile. Because if there's one thing Claressa Shields doesn't tolerate, it's being cast as insecure or secondary in someone else's story. And fans know that, which is why so many are bracing for what happens next, not because she's obligated to respond, but because when she does speak, she rarely whispers. The question now isn't whether she's furious, it's whether she decides to address it at all. Because if she does, the conversation won't stay confined to one Breakfast Club clip. It will expand into respect, media responsibility, and the price of dragging old narratives into new lives. And if she doesn't, that silence may speak even louder. As the clip continued to circulate, the story stopped being about a single question and started becoming about power dynamics. Who controls narratives, who benefits from nostalgia, and who pays the emotional price when the past is resurrected for content. The internet doesn't just consume moments like this. It assigns meaning, often faster than the people involved can react. And in this case, the meaning kept shifting. Some viewers zeroed in on Papoose's composure, interpreting it as the calm of someone who has already processed that chapter of his life. Others argued the exact opposite. That restraint can sometimes mask unresolved tension, especially when the question hits close to home. The pause before his answer became the most replayed part of the clip. A half-second of silence stretched into entire theories. But what really escalated things was how quickly the conversation turned toward Claressa Shields' position in all of this. Because unlike a former partner, Claressa is present tense. She's not a memory. She's not a chapter in a documentary. She's a living, breathing partner whose life intersects with Papoose right now. and many fans felt the interview failed to acknowledge, and the answers weren't flattering. Escalation would benefit platforms, not people. Drama would feed algorithms, not relationships. That realization shifted the tone from excitement to unease. Meanwhile, Claressa's supporters pushed back hard against narratives painting her as jealous or threatened. They reminded everyone that anger isn't the only valid reaction to disrespect. Sometimes distance is. Sometimes silence is strength, not insecurity. That reframing mattered. It turned the conversation from "why is she mad?" to "why was this necessary?" And once that question takes hold, the focus moves away from personal reactions and toward systemic patterns: how media treats relationships, how women are positioned in narratives built around men, and how the past is often weaponized against the present. By the end of the week, the clip was still circulating, but the energy had changed. The comments weren't as loud. The takes weren't as reckless. People seemed to recognize that this wasn't a storyline begging for continuation. It was a moment exposing the tension between relevance and respect. And in that tension, everyone involved appeared to choose restraint, not because they were silenced, but because they were aware. Aware that sometimes the most powerful response isn't a clapback, a live, or a viral rant. It's refusing to turn your life into content for someone else's engagement. That choice doesn't erase what happened, but it changes how it lands. And as the internet moved on to the next controversy, one thing lingered quietly in the background: the understanding that not every loaded question deserves a loud answer, and not every silence is an admission. By the time the moment stopped trending, what remained wasn't outrage. It was a lingering discomfort that refused to fully dissipate. Not because anyone had said too much, but because something important had been brushed up against and then deliberately left untouched. And that, for many viewers, was more unsettling than any explosive argument could have been. The final shift in the narrative came quietly. There was no breaking headline, no dramatic response, no viral clapback to close the loop. Instead, there was a noticeable recalibration across the board, a collective decision, whether coordinated or instinctive, to step back from the edge. For Claressa Shields, that recalibration looked like distance. She didn't address the interview directly. She didn't validate the outrage or deny it. She continued posting about her career, her training, her future, subtly reminding everyone that she exists in motion, not in reaction. To her supporters, that was the loudest statement she could make. To critics, it was frustratingly opaque. But opacity in this case may have been the point, because responding would have meant legitimizing a narrative that centered someone else's past at the expense of her present. And refusing to do that is, in itself, a form of control. It signals that not every provocation deserves acknowledgement, especially when the cost of engagement outweighs the benefit. Papoose's silence followed a similar pattern. He didn't clarify his answer. He didn't expand on it. He didn't attempt to fix how it was received. That restraint suggested a man acutely aware of how easily explanations can become accelerants. In choosing not to revisit the topic, he effectively closed the door that the interview had cracked open. For longtime fans, that choice felt intentional. They've watched him navigate public life long enough to know that when he speaks, it's usually with purpose. So when he doesn't, it's rarely accidental. In this context, silence read less like avoidance and more like protection of his current life, his partner, and the peace he's clearly trying to maintain. The Breakfast Club, too, seemed to take note. There were no follow-up segments, no clarifying clips, no leaning into the backlash for clicks. That restraint stood out, especially given the platform's history of capitalizing on viral moments. It suggested that someone, or several someones, recognized that the line between conversation and provocation had come into focus. And once that line is visible, crossing it again becomes a choice. As days passed, the internet's attention shifted elsewhere, but the implications of the moment lingered. Comment sections began to reflect a more reflective tone. People talked less about tea and more about media responsibility. Less about who was mad and more about why certain questions keep getting asked. That shift matters. It indicates growth, not just from the people involved, but from the audience consuming the content. A recognition that while nostalgia fuels engagement, it can also reopen wounds that no longer need air. What ultimately emerged from the situation wasn't a winner or a loser. It was a boundary, a reminder that relationships evolve, and that constantly anchoring people to their pasts, especially in public, can undermine the very growth everyone claims to celebrate. It also highlighted how women, particularly those stepping into relationships with men who have public histories, are often expected to absorb comparisons quietly. Claressa Shields didn't do that. She didn't fight the narrative head-on, but she didn't internalize it either. She simply refused to center it. And in doing so, she modeled a kind of response that doesn't translate easily into viral content, but carries weight nonetheless. The real takeaway from the entire situation isn't about anger or jealousy or unresolved feelings. It's about who gets to decide what stories are still relevant. Is it the media, chasing engagement? Is it the audience, hungry for callbacks? Or is it the people actually living the lives being discussed? In this case, the answer seemed clear by the end. The people involved chose themselves over spectacle, and that choice quietly diffused what could have become a much larger controversy. There may never be a definitive statement. There may never be closure in the way the internet prefers. But sometimes closure doesn't come from explanation. It comes from action. From silence that isn't empty but deliberate. From a refusal to perform emotion for public consumption. As the story faded from the trending list, it left behind something more valuable than drama. A conversation about respect, timing, and the limits of nostalgia. And that conversation, even without a headline, may be the most important outcome of all. If you're still here, that means you didn't just watch a moment, you recognized the shift. This wasn't about outrage. It was about watching people quietly choose boundaries over spectacle, and that's something you don't see often anymore. Now here's where you matter. Hit the like button if you believe respect should outweigh nostalgia, and that people shouldn't be permanently tied to their past just because the internet finds it entertaining. That one click helps push conversations like this in a more thoughtful direction instead of feeding the same recycled chaos. Drop a comment with what stood out to you most. Was it the pause, the silence afterward, the way no one rushed to escalate? Those details tell a bigger story than any headline ever could, and your perspective adds depth others might miss. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is your sign. Stories like this don't always end with explosions. Sometimes they end with restraint, and those moments are easy to overlook unless you're paying attention. Being subscribed means you catch the patterns, not just the noise. Turn on notifications now, not because more drama is guaranteed, but because if anyone speaks next, it won't be accidental. It'll be intentional, measured, and meaningful. And you'll want to understand why, not just react to what. This wasn't about picking sides. It was about recognizing growth, boundaries, and when silence is the strongest response. Stay observant, stay grounded, and stay locked in, because the quiet moments usually say the most.